There are more than one set of principles, and people adapted and applied principles to their centenaries. There's obviously the CRC, HLF. There's also the ethical and shared remembering principles, which had tremendous reach into councils and communities and faith communities throughout Northern Ireland. And I also wanted to reference the Northern Ireland Assembly principles and process, because they did enable the Assembly through the Speaker's Office, as Eamon outlined, from 2012 to 2021 to agree a process of what were they going to notice and how they were going to do that. Also, museums, good relation programs and community groups applied sets of principles based on CRC, HLF, ethical and shared remembering, and their own set of museum ethics. So it seems to me that the principles did a number of things. One, that they were a common framework, and in particular the toolkit, which was Stella Byrne's brainchild, really, which went through successive editions but was reprinted again and again. And it's also important to notice that while the principles weren't always explicit, they were implicit in the funding guidelines and in the conversations that people had about funding. And that was very clear from some of the work with Mid-Ulster and CRC. And there were also a whole set of council-funded local museums, and I looked at three in particular, which Causeway, Lisburn and Newry. And those museums worked separately but also complementary to council programmes. And in terms of the museum's ethics, some of those museums, Causeway and Mid and East Antrim, understood their role as a facilitation role, something that they ended up calling the Limavady Declaration, out of a particular conference that looked at shared and challenging heritage. And in the situation of Lisburn, where they sort of talked about an authentic welcome, but that was about real objects, real people, and in real contexts. And I wanted to draw attention to some of the common features and differences. As Eamon has said, and as Paul has said, historical context, different perspectives. But I think there was also something that's very clear about welcoming and invitational, and people trying to remember ethically and looking at things from a range of different types of perspectives. And the partnership and collaboration was key. And where there were differences, they were sort of practical things like, people linking it to the organisations they wanted to work for, or Belfast City Council and the Union Centenary Committee both talked about evidence-based, which suggested a commonality of their conversation. The Belfast 2016 grouping that organised the West Belfast Centenary Easter Rising Parade and a whole lot of related activity talked about engaging across all of the political Republican history, but also with a narrative of hospitality. And the Union Centenaries, again, that committee, there was a sense of being mindful of others. And the wording was that to increase understanding after considering the broader implication of their events. So there was that sense where people were aware that they were operating in a space where they didn't want to do harm above all else. So the next section I want to look at is the sort of structures that were operating, because people were operating in very intense political environments, in councils in particular, but also in those locally council-funded museums that are sort of critical to difficult history and to engaging with their local communities. In Newry and Mourne in particular, there was an old established diversity working group that grew out of very early work with the Community Relations Council and Newry and Mourne Council. And it was made up of councillors from all political parties and independents. And they were able to do three things. They were able to run a grant scheme that's sort of detailed there, but they were also able to organise formal commemorative activity around both the Rising and the Somme. And in particular, some of that building new relationships for the first time with the British Legion. And some of that was mirrored in work throughout Northern Ireland and local councils where people were using principles, the toolkit in particular, and using lectures and exhibitions and touring, particularly a big emphasis on people using different sorts of venues and touring exhibitions. And so in applying those principles, some of the things I wanted to think about was that by broadening the context, there was an ability to tell multiple perspectives, and that was really clear in terms of broadening the Somme and the Rising into the context of the First World War. And some of the people who talked about the Action for Conflict Transformation, the Shankill Road, talks about in its exhibition the 30,000 Irish men who died in the First World War. the nationalist contribution is addressed by all sorts of partners and stakeholders. Republicans of West Belfast look at the 6th Connacht Rangers and the community play that drew in partners based around building communities resource centre in Ballymoney, Meek and the Major, which eventually toured nationalist and unionist areas throughout North Antrim. So people were able to use multiple perspectives to reach into and to make to reach into different communities and to tell a broader story. And so one of the early principles that we had before the CRC-HLF principles were finalised was can travel. And that sense of exhibitions travelling was about them being able to travel in terms of what was in them and where they went to. And in particular, Libraries NI became a very important resource for exhibitions to go either whether they were developed by Newry Museum, taking them into Kilkeel and all around a very large district, or Prony taking Con and Eva, which was their exhibition about the Gore Booth women, Countess Markovics and Eva Gore Booth, taking those all around Northern Ireland. Public history is probably the most widely used method of communicating and involving people and engaging people, and Eamon has demonstrated that in spades, really. And it was particularly powerful when it was linked to site visits, as the Ards North Down Council did with their Living History programme, where there were site visits, a busy day in Dublin looking at the Rising and the First World War and the discussions that followed that in the evenings afterwards, and watching the relationships build. Drama, not only was it Halfway House by Philip Orr, The Box by Kibosh, or Blood on the Rose down in Mid-Ulster, but there was Medal in a Drawer, the 1st of July, and sort of countless plays that were really about trying to encouraging empathy, also provoking people to think about what the war was really like, and inviting people to stand in the shoes of the other. And finally, digital technology took off, and I will leave that to Niall's very capable hands. I want to just, for the next 2 slides, focus a little bit on what Mid-Ulster were doing and what they were saying. And so what they were, in a sense, doing was increasing access and understanding. I'm not going to repeat what's on the slides there. And so that's what the effect of their grant aid was, they thought. And in particular, draw attention to the sorts of examples that they gave, which is like the Co-War Memorial Group. You know, a predominantly Protestant town in the middle of Tyrone, people have come through the Troubles. There's been a lot of heartache, and yet they're determined, that particular group, to be inclusive of the Catholic community in terms of the War Memorial. And I suppose the most common thing that was said about lectures was people were overheard to say, I didn't know that. But that was all based on, well, not all based, but it was partly based on creating an atmosphere in which people felt safe, using venues and different speakers, like local speakers from some associations or whatever, and themes like including the Irish language or the First World War or the Clarks, to signal a wealth. So I want in this almost penultimate section to talk about community initiatives and the big parades, because as Paul rightly said, the commemoration is about forgetting, and it's very much about what's happening in the present and how we try to construct that present, as Eamon said, to the grandchildren. Maybe that was Paul. The Somme was commemorated in France in July and September 2016, organised by an NGO, the Somme Association, was able, with the help of the Northern Ireland office, to bring together, to attend that event, 2,500 people, mainly from the memorial associations in Northern Ireland. They had to fight tooth and nail as an organisation to make sure that that event actually happened, because, you know, the trenches were the big scene in 2016. The royal households, political figures north and south were present. And then they recreated that, or not recreated, but they did a second at the end of this Battle of the Somme at Guillemont to recognise the 16th Irish. And after the first event, both of which were televised, I mean, Carol Walker said, you know, people were coming up to her in the supermarket and saying, we watched that. Well done. That was really, 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 really important. And that sense of where people feel acknowledged, and for the Somme Association, it felt that they were able to deliver what they wanted, which was that everybody was included. And in 2016, when And in fact, the DUP became the Minister for Education. They funded battle trips to the Somme, copying what had been already happening in England from 2014. And the Somme Association managed and led those and made sure that those were very mixed groups, small numbers from each school, different types of schools, kids from different backgrounds, with a very clear itinerary of step by step. And then you had the Rising March parade the Rising Parade in March 2016 in West Belfast. There are also parades by a range of political groups in North Belfast and Coal Island, etc. But the big one is in Belfast. And that's organised by the Belfast 2016 Committee and the Belfast National Graves Association. And then there are subgroups that organise, like in Short Strand, drama and reenactment, and murals in South Belfast, the Core family in North Belfast, in relation to Charlie Monaghan. And I mentioned that because, in the big commemoration, obviously, of the Easter Rising was in Dublin. But in Northern Ireland, there was a very clear attempt to ensure that there was something physically happening on the ground that people could go to and could acknowledge. And then there were some joint commemorations, and that was the Somme Rising in early February, organised by the Rural Community Network and REACT, attracting people who they'd previously worked from Loyalist and Republican, Nationalist and Unionist and no communities, who'd been through either programmes or who they had advised and helped to put together their own programmes. And that was pretty unique, and that was fairly risky. And there were the Poppy and the Lily presentations and discussions at toured community venues, and those were by Philip Orr as a historian of the Somme and Joe Austin as chairman of the Belfast National Graves Association. Talks by the Fellowship of the Saints that brought together ex-combatants and groups like Psalm 100 that have very varied and mixed programme around the First World War and the Somme. The big parades were very definitely past, present and future. One of the organisers of the Somme parade and reenactment in Woodvale Park said to me, he said, what you had to notice was people were taking selfies. And in those taking of the selfies, they're creating their own memories of those events that are bringing them into the present and into the future. And those big parades were also telling a story of the connection between the UVF of the past and the UVF of the present. And they were telling a story of the Rising and the Republican movement as in Sinn Féin. And that's unmistakably was happening within those parades. There were solemn faces of the participants. There was huge organisation of participants in relation to the Somme reenactment. There was the making of a tank from wood. There was drilling going on for weeks. There were people making uniforms and trying to be exact copies, and people were paying a lot of attention to detail. There's also large-scale commemorative events in the Ulster Hall and the Waterfront Hall with thousands of people using the arts as a way to create and to tell a story within that. And in that, there is a holding on to cultural anchors. And I don't think we have a right, and I don't think anybody's attempting to undermine those cultural anchors. And I have to say also, in my view, those were not triumphalists. They were not belittling the other. And they were also taking place in the context of respectful listening by people's participation in other events. And those other events were things like Féile talks over in West Belfast, the Fellowship of Messines talks, Psalm 100, and in councils and in museums throughout Northern Ireland. And there was a sense from one of the people I spoke to, he said, it was the Loyalist leadership that was able to was robust enough to tell a more complicated story sometimes and bring their people with them. And I think that was also true within the Republican leadership. And there was sensitivity about roots and about what would be on display. And there were behind the scenes negotiations and discussions to try to allay fears, ensure things would go off all right, that people would be understood. And there was also a bit of a pride being taken in, did we do this in a way that the other community acknowledged that we were trying to be okay about how we did this? There was a generosity and there was a mindfulness. Implications. So this is contentious history, and there were some, not very many, controversies. And so I think, what did the principles mean? In a sense, I think the common framework and the holding of a ring and a big tent into which people were invited were key, so that it enabled people to tell, a specific story, which, say, for instance, the Lisburn's burnings. That is a hard story to tell. But you can tell that story much more easily when you know that there are other stories being told, that you've already done some work on the First World War, that you've covered the Somme and you've covered the Rising, as Lisburn Museum did, in spades. But I think that what has happened with the principles that everybody has been engaged with, and with the endeavour, has been that we've contributed to our understanding of what is appropriate in the public space. But as we move through to the Troubles, then I think it has to be the principles plus. And I think we have to, in some way, be able to address both the situation in which there are well-known events, but there are lots of people who are privately remembered. And I think that Paul put it, and I put it a bit differently, but it's mourning the dead, but mourning the dead of the other. And that is going to be a real challenge for us as a community. But like the Decade of Centenaries, which was, as Jacqueline says, a construct, we can't ignore these. They're not going to be not acknowledged. They're not going to be not commemorated. So what do we as a society try to do around that? And I think one of the things, because I think, I don't think we're at a point where we can agree to build memorials. We cannot actually have an executive that was able to agree that it would put its weight behind the Day of Reflection. But I think we do have to put our weight behind the Day of Reflection. So to end, I hope I've done something in terms of showing how the principles were translated into action. But it took many people, many organisations, different approaches in different places. And that sort of sense of partnership and of creating a space within which it's understood how we all try to operate will continue to be fairly fundamental in moving forward.